My uncle joked my adopted daughter wasn't real family. He went silent when I mentioned his DNA test. The first time my uncle Gregory made the comment, my daughter Maya was only 6 months home from China. We were at my parents' house for Easter dinner, and Maya was sitting in her high chair, wearing a little yellow dress my mom had bought her. She had these perfect round cheeks and dark eyes that lit up when anyone smiled at her. Gregory walked past her on his way to get another beer from the kitchen and stopped to look at her. He said loud enough for half the room to hear that it was nice we were fostering, but when were we planning to have real kids of our own? My wife Lauren's hand tightened around her fork, but she didn't say anything. I told Gregory that Maya was our real daughter and we'd finalized her adoption 3 months ago. He laughed and said, I knew what he meant. That blood was thicker than water and all that. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me sitting there with my jaw clenched and Lauren staring down at her plate. My mom came over a few minutes later and touched my shoulder, saying Gregory didn't mean anything by it, that he just didn't understand adoption. I told her it didn't matter what he understood. He needed to stop making comments like that. Mom said she'd talk to him, but her voice had that tone that meant she wouldn't actually do anything. She'd spent 50 years making excuses for Gregory's behavior, and I knew she wasn't going to start holding him accountable now. Lauren and I finished dinner as quickly as we could and left early, Maya falling asleep in her car seat on the drive home. Lauren was quiet the whole way, and when we got inside, she finally said what we were both thinking. She asked if we were going to have to deal with this at every family gathering. I told her I hoped not, but I wasn't sure. Gregory had always been the family member who said whatever came into his head without thinking about how it affected anyone else. The comments continued at every gathering after that. At my dad's birthday in June, Gregory asked when we were going to give Maya a real sibling. At the 4th of July barbecue, he told his friend visiting from out of state that we'd bought our daughter from China because we couldn't have biological kids. That part was actually true. Lauren had endometriosis that made pregnancy nearly impossible, but the way he said it made it sound like we'd ordered Maya from a catalog. At Thanksgiving, Gregory brought it up again, asking if we were worried Maya would want to find her real parents when she got older. Lauren left the table and went to sit in the car. I found her there 20 minutes later, crying and saying she couldn't do this anymore. She asked why my family couldn't just accept that Maya was our daughter, why there always had to be this implication that she wasn't good enough or wasn't really ours. I promised Lauren I'd talk to Gregory directly, one-on-one, and make him understand that his comments had to stop. I called him the next day and asked to meet for coffee. He agreed, sounding confused about why I wanted to talk. We met at a place downtown, and I got straight to the point. I told him his comments about Maya were hurting both me and Lauren, and they needed to stop. Gregory leaned back in his chair and said he was just being honest, that everyone was thinking the same thing, but he was the only one willing to say it. He asked if I really believed Maya would ever see me as her real father when she got older, and started asking questions about where she came from. I felt my hands shaking, and I told him that, yes, I was her real father because I was the one raising her, loving her, and being there for her every single day. Gregory shrugged and said I could believe whatever I wanted, but biology mattered whether I liked it or not. I left that coffee shop knowing Gregory wasn't going to change. He believed what he believed, and no conversation was going to shift that. I told Lauren about the meeting, and she said we needed to start limiting our time with my family. She didn't want Maya growing up hearing these comments and internalizing the message that she didn't belong. I agreed, and we started declining invitations to family gatherings. My mom called me upset, asking why we were suddenly avoiding everyone. I explained that Gregory's comments were damaging, and until he stopped, we needed space. Mom said I was being too sensitive and breaking up the family over nothing. I told her it wasn't nothing to us, and we hung up with tension between us for the first time in years. My dad called next, trying to play mediator. He said Gregory was just old-fashioned in his thinking and didn't mean any harm. I asked Dad why everyone kept making excuses for Gregory, instead of telling him to stop being cruel. Dad went quiet, and then said he'd see what he could do. Christmas was coming up, and my mom called, begging us to come to the family gathering at her house. She promised Gregory would behave, and she'd talk to him beforehand about keeping his opinions to himself. Lauren was hesitant, but Maya was almost 2 years old now and starting to really engage with family. We decided to give it one more chance. Christmas morning, we drove to my parents' house with Maya in her red velvet dress, excited to see her grandparents. The first hour went smoothly. Maya played with the other kids, and Gregory kept his distance, staying in the kitchen with the other adults. Then came present time. My mom had bought Maya a beautiful doll with dark hair and Asian features, something she'd clearly chosen carefully to reflect Maya's heritage. Gregory saw it and made a comment that we were really committing to the bit, weren't we? My sister's husband laughed before catching himself. Lauren stood up immediately, told Maya to say goodbye to Grandma, and headed for the door. I followed with our daughter, and we left without eating dinner or opening any more presents. In the car, Lauren said she was done, completely done with my family. She said we'd given them chance after chance, and they kept showing us exactly who they were. Maya was crying in her car seat because she didn't understand why we'd left so suddenly. I felt torn between my wife and daughter on one side and my family on the other, but I knew Lauren was right. We couldn't keep exposing Maya to this toxicity. When we got home, I sent a group text to my immediate family explaining that we wouldn't be attending any more gatherings where Gregory was present. My mom called within minutes, crying and saying I was forcing her to choose between her son and her grandson. I corrected her, saying she was actually choosing between her brother and her granddaughter, and that should be an easy choice. She hung up on me. My dad texted later saying I was being unreasonable and tearing the family apart over Gregory's poor sense of humor. The next few months were quiet. We didn't attend my cousin's wedding in February or my nephew's baptism in March. My sister called occasionally to tell me I was missing out on family moments and being stubborn. I asked her if she'd ever told Gregory to stop making his comments, and she admitted she hadn't because it wasn't her place. I said it wasn't my place either to keep subjecting my daughter to someone who thought she wasn't really part of our family. My sister sighed and said she understood where I was coming from, but family was complicated. I told her it didn't feel that complicated to me. Either people treated Maya like family or they didn't get access to her. The conversation ended awkwardly, and we didn't talk for weeks after that. Lauren said she was proud of me for holding the boundary, but I could tell it was costing me relationships with people I'd been close to my whole life. In May, my dad had a heart attack, not a severe one, but scary enough that he spent 3 days in the hospital. My mom called me from the emergency room, her voice shaking, and I drove there immediately. Lauren stayed home with Maya, and I spent that night in the hospital waiting room with my sister and my mom. Gregory showed up around midnight, and we nodded at each other, but didn't speak. When Dad was finally stable and moved to a regular room, the doctor said he'd need to make lifestyle changes and reduce stress. Mom looked at me pointedly when the doctor mentioned stress, like my boundary with Gregory was somehow responsible for Dad's heart attack. I ignored the implication and focused on Dad, who looked small and tired in the hospital bed. He asked me to come back the next day so we could talk, just the two of us. I agreed and went home as the sun was coming up, exhausted and worried. The next afternoon, I returned to the hospital alone. Dad was sitting up in bed, looking better than he had the night before. He told me he'd been thinking about the situation with Gregory and our family. He said he understood why I was protecting Maya from hurtful comments, but he wished I'd find a way to do it without cutting off the whole family. I asked him why no one had ever demanded that Gregory change his behavior instead of demanding that I tolerate it. Dad was quiet for a moment, then admitted that was a fair point. He said Gregory had always been this way, saying things without filters, and everyone had just learned to ignore him or laugh it off. I told Dad that I couldn't teach my daughter to ignore someone telling her she wasn't really family. Dad nodded slowly and said he'd try to talk to Gregory, really talk to him this time, about respecting our family. I thanked him and told him I loved him. He squeezed my hand and said he loved me too, and he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. 2 weeks after Dad came home from the hospital, my mom called with an invitation to a small family dinner. She said it would just be my parents, me, Lauren, Maya, and my sister with her family. Gregory wouldn't be there. She wanted a chance for everyone to spend time together without tension. Lauren was skeptical, but I could hear how much this meant to my mom, and I missed my parents. We agreed to come for Sunday dinner. That Sunday, we drove over with Maya, who was now talking in full sentences and excited to see Grandma and Grandpa. Dinner was actually pleasant. My sister and I caught up on each other's lives, and my parents played with Maya, who was delighted to have their attention. For a few hours, it felt like things might actually heal. Then Gregory walked in through the back door, uninvited, saying Mom had told him about the dinner and he'd decided to stop by. My mom's face went pale, and she immediately said she hadn't told him. Gregory laughed and said he'd heard about it from my aunt, who'd heard it from my mom. Lauren stood up immediately and started gathering Maya's things. I could see my mom starting to cry, and my sister looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Gregory asked why everyone was being so dramatic, saying he just wanted to see his family. I stood up and told Gregory he needed to leave. He said it was Mom and Dad's house, not mine, and I couldn't kick him out. That's when I said something I'd been holding back for years. I told Gregory that if he wanted to talk about real family and biology, we could start with the DNA test he took last year. The room went completely silent. Gregory's face changed, the smug expression disappearing instantly. He asked what I was talking about, his voice suddenly sharp instead of joking. I said we could discuss it right here in front of everyone if that's what he wanted. My mom asked what DNA test, looking between me and Gregory with confusion. Gregory told me to shut up, that I didn't know what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and asked if he wanted me to show everyone the results. The backstory of how I knew about Gregory's DNA test went back 6 months. My cousin Derek, Gregory's son, had called me out of nowhere asking to meet. We'd been close growing up, but had drifted apart as adults, especially after I stopped attending family gatherings. Derek and I met at a bar downtown, and he looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. He ordered a drink, drank half of it quickly, and then told me something that had been eating at him for months. He said his dad, Gregory, had done one of those ancestry DNA tests, the kind you send in and get back your ethnic background and potential relatives. Derek had done one at the same time, thinking it would be fun to compare results with his father. When the results came back, Derek's test showed he had a significant amount of Native American ancestry, around 25%. Gregory's test showed 0. Derek initially thought it was a mistake, but when he looked at the relative matches, he didn't match with Gregory at all, not even his distant relatives. He matched with people on his mother's side, but nothing on Gregory's side. Derek told me he'd confronted his mother, Gregory's ex-wife, who'd broken down crying and admitted to an affair 30 years ago. Derek wasn't Gregory's biological son. She'd suspected it might be true, but had never confirmed it until the DNA test forced her hand. Derek had gone through every emotion possible over the past few months. Shock, anger, confusion, grief for the father he thought he had. He asked me why I thought Gregory was so obsessed with blood and biology being important. I said I didn't know, but it explained a lot. Derek made me promise not to tell anyone because he was still processing it and hadn't decided what to do with the information. He just needed someone outside the immediate situation to know. I'd kept that promise for 6 months, carrying the weight of that secret while listening to Gregory spout his opinions about real family and biology. But standing there in my parents' dining room with Gregory trying to crash our family dinner after months of his cruel comments about my daughter, I was done protecting his secret. Gregory took a step toward me, his face red, and demanded I put my phone away. I stayed calm and said I would, right after he left, and agreed to stop making comments about Maya not being real family. My dad, still weak from his heart attack, asked what was going on. I kept my eyes on Gregory and said he could explain it himself, or I could explain it for him. Gregory's hands were shaking now, and he looked at my mom with something like panic in his eyes. He said I was lying, trying to make up stories to get back at him. I asked him if he wanted me to call Derek right now and put him on speaker. Gregory went very still. My sister finally spoke up, asking what Derek had to do with anything. I said Derek had information about Gregory that might change how we all thought about family and biology. Lauren was standing by the door with Maya, watching everything unfold. My mom kept asking what was happening, her voice getting higher and more distressed with each question. Gregory finally broke. He told me I was a cruel bastard for bringing this up in front of everyone. I said he'd had hundreds of opportunities to stop being cruel to my daughter, and he'd chosen to keep going. He said the two situations weren't the same thing at all. I said they were exactly the same thing, both about who counted as real family and how biology did or didn't define those relationships. My dad told both of us to stop talking in circles and explain what was going on. Gregory looked at me with genuine hatred in his eyes and asked if I was really going to do this. I said that was entirely up to him. He could leave right now, apologize to me and Lauren and Maya, and agree to never make another comment about adoption or real family. Or we could continue this conversation with everyone present. The choice was his. My mom was crying now, begging us both to stop, saying she couldn't handle more stress. My sister sat frozen with her mouth slightly open, trying to process what was being implied. Gregory stood there for what felt like a full minute, his jaw working like he was chewing words he didn't want to say. Finally, he looked at Maya, who was holding Lauren's hand and watching all the adults with worried eyes. He turned back to me and said fine. He said he was sorry for his comments about Maya. The words came out stiff and forced, but they came out. He said he wouldn't make any more comments about adoption or biology. I asked if he meant it, or if he was just saying it to keep his secret. Gregory's face twisted with anger, but he said he meant it. He looked at my parents and said he was leaving and they should call him later. He walked out the back door without saying anything else, and we all heard his car start and drive away. The dining room was silent, except for my mom crying quietly, and my dad sitting in his chair looking older than I'd ever seen him. My sister was the first to speak, asking what just happened. My mom demanded to know what DNA test I was talking about. I looked at my dad and said that was a conversation for Gregory to have with them, not me. I'd made my point, which was that judging families based on biology was rich coming from someone in Gregory's position. Lauren took Maya out to the car, and I told my parents I was sorry for the confrontation but not sorry for protecting my daughter. My dad nodded slowly, not saying anything. My sister followed me to the door and whispered that she needed to know what I knew about Gregory. I told her to call Derek if she wanted the full story, but the basic truth was that Gregory had no room to talk about real family when he'd been raising a son who wasn't biologically his for 30 years. My sister's eyes went wide, and I could see her mind putting pieces together. I left before anyone could ask more questions, getting in the car where Lauren was singing softly to Maya to calm her down after all the yelling. The drive home was quiet. Lauren asked if I regretted saying what I'd said, and I told her honestly that I didn't. She said she was glad because watching me stand up for Maya like that made her feel protected too, like we were a team against everyone who tried to diminish our family. Maya fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted from the emotional chaos, even though she didn't understand what had happened. When we got home and put her to bed, Lauren and I sat on the couch and talked about what came next. We both knew I'd detonated something in my family that couldn't be undone. My phone was already buzzing with texts from my sister demanding more information and my mom asking me to call her. I turned my phone off and told Lauren we'd deal with it tomorrow. That night, I slept better than I had in months, The weight of protecting Gregory's secret finally lifted. The next morning, my phone had 17 missed calls and twice as many texts. Most were from my sister, who'd apparently called Derek and gotten the full story. She was furious at Gregory for his hypocrisy and at me for keeping the secret for 6 months. My mom had called 8 times, her voicemails progressing from confused to angry to hurt. My dad had sent one text that just said they needed to talk. I called him first, figuring he'd be the most rational. He answered on the first ring and said Gregory had called him late last night, confirming everything I'd implied. Dad said he'd spent 30 years thinking Derek was his nephew, his brother's son, and now he didn't know what to think. I told Dad I was sorry he had to find out this way, but I'd been carrying Gregory's secret while listening to him attack my family, and I'd finally had enough. Dad was quiet for a long moment, then said he understood why I'd done it, even if he wished I'd handled it differently. My conversation with my mom was harder. She called me while I was making breakfast, and her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. She said I'd humiliated Gregory in front of the family and destroyed whatever chance we had of healing our relationships. I told her Gregory had been humiliating me and my daughter for 2 years, and no one had stepped in to stop him. Mom said what Gregory did was wrong, but what I did was worse because I'd weaponized private family information. I asked her if she realized how ironic it was that she was defending Gregory's privacy while he'd spent years publicly questioning whether my daughter was really family. Mom started crying and said I was tearing the family apart, that Dad's heart couldn't take this kind of stress. I felt a stab of guilt about Dad, but I told Mom that I hadn't created this situation. Gregory had, with years of cruel comments. I just finally stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own hypocrisy. We hung up, with neither of us feeling better. My sister called an hour later, and I could hear the anger in her voice before she even said hello. She demanded to know why I'd kept Derek's information secret for 6 months. I explained that Derek had asked me not to tell anyone while he processed what he'd learned. My sister said I should have told her that we told each other everything. I reminded her that she'd sat silently through dozens of Gregory's comments about Maya without ever defending us, so maybe we didn't actually tell each other everything. She went quiet, then admitted that was fair. She said she'd talked to Derek that morning, and he was devastated that his personal information had come out the way it did. I felt genuinely bad about that. Derek had trusted me with something incredibly painful, and I'd used it as ammunition in a family fight. I called Derek immediately after hanging up with my sister. He answered, sounding exhausted, and said he knew why I was calling. Derek said he wasn't mad at me for revealing the information, or at least he understood why I'd done it. He said he was processing a lot of feelings about his dad and about the situation with my family. He asked if Gregory had really been that cruel about Maya, and I gave him examples of the comments over the past 2 years. Derek was quiet, then said he'd always known his dad had strong opinions, but hadn't realized how much he'd been directing them at my family. He told me that learning Gregory wasn't his biological father had been devastating, but watching how Gregory treated adopted family members made him wonder if biology had always been more important to his dad than he'd realized. I said I was sorry Derek was caught in the middle of this mess. He said it wasn't my fault and thanked me for keeping his secret as long as I had. We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of it, I felt like maybe Derek and I could rebuild our relationship despite everything. 3 days after the confrontation, Gregory called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. He didn't say hello, just asked if I was satisfied now that I'd destroyed his relationship with his family. I told him I hadn't destroyed anything, that he'd done that himself by spending years being cruel to my daughter. Gregory said his comments were never meant to be cruel, just honest observations about adoption and biology. I asked him if he still thought biology was more important than the actual relationships we build and maintain. He went silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised me. He admitted that finding out Derek wasn't his biological son had shaken his whole worldview about family. He'd spent 30 years raising Derek, and in his mind, that made Derek his son regardless of DNA. But he'd never connected that logic to my situation with Maya. I asked him why not, and he couldn't give me an answer. I told Gregory that his apology at my parents' house had been forced, and if he wanted any chance of rebuilding a relationship with me or with Maya, he'd need to do better than that. He asked what I wanted from him. I said I wanted him to actually understand why his comments were damaging and hurtful. I wanted him to recognize that Maya was just as much my daughter as Derek was his son. Gregory was quiet again, then said he needed time to think about everything. I said that was fine, but while he was thinking, he needed to stay away from my family. We hung up without any resolution, but the conversation felt different than any we'd had before. For the first time, Gregory seemed to be actually considering what his words had meant, rather than just defending his right to say them. I told Lauren about the call, and she said she wasn't ready to forgive him yet, but maybe it was a start. The next few weeks were tense. My mom and I spoke occasionally, brief conversations where she'd update me on Dad's health, and I'd tell her how Maya was doing. We carefully avoided talking about Gregory or the confrontation. My sister and I had a longer conversation where she apologized for not standing up for us more over the past 2 years. She said watching the situation with Gregory and Derek unfold had made her realize how much she'd been complicit in allowing harmful behavior to continue. She promised to do better, and I believed her. My dad called every few days. and slowly we rebuilt our relationship without Gregory in the middle of it. Dad said he'd talked to Gregory several times and that his brother was genuinely struggling with what had happened. I told Dad I was willing to have a conversation with Gregory eventually, but only if it was going to be a real conversation, not more excuses or defensiveness. Maya turned 3 in July, and we had a small birthday party at our house. We invited my parents, my sister and her family, and Derek with his mom. Gregory wasn't invited, and everyone understood why. The party was actually fun, relaxed in a way family gatherings hadn't been in years. Maya played with her cousins, and my mom helped blow up balloons while my dad supervised the grill. Derek spent time talking to Lauren about what it was like adopting from China, saying he was thinking about adopting himself someday. Watching Derek play with Maya, tickling her until she shrieked with laughter, I felt grateful that at least one good thing had come from the whole mess. Derek and I had reconnected, and he was building a relationship with Maya that was based on love, not biology. My sister pulled me aside during the party and said she'd talked to Gregory the day before. He'd asked about Maya's birthday and seemed sad that he wasn't invited. My sister said she'd told him that was the consequence of his actions, and he'd have to live with it. 2 months after the confrontation, Gregory called and asked if we could meet for coffee. I talked to Lauren about it first, and she said the decision was mine, but she wasn't ready to see him yet. I agreed to meet Gregory at the same downtown coffee shop where we'd had our failed conversation 2 years earlier. He was already there when I arrived, looking older and more tired than I remembered. We got our drinks and sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Gregory started talking. He said he'd spent the past 2 months in therapy, working through his feelings about Derek and about family and about the way he'd treated me and Maya. His therapist had helped him understand that his obsession with biology had been rooted in fear that if biology didn't matter, then nothing did. Fear that relationships could be arbitrary or temporary. Fear that without blood ties, family would fall apart. Gregory said learning about Derek had forced him to confront that fear. Derek was his son in every way that mattered, and biology had nothing to do with the strength of that relationship. He said he'd been wrong about Maya, wrong about adoption, wrong about what made family real. His voice cracked when he said he was sorry for every comment he'd made, for the pain he'd caused, for the damage he'd done to my marriage and to my relationship with the rest of our family. He said he didn't expect me to forgive him immediately or maybe ever, but he wanted me to know he was working on being better. I sat there processing his words, looking for the defensiveness or the excuses I'd expected, but they weren't there. This apology felt real in a way the forced one at my parents' house hadn't. I told Gregory I appreciated him taking accountability, and I believed he was sincere, but I also told him that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent behavior, not just words. Gregory nodded and said he understood. He asked if there was any chance he could eventually meet Maya properly, as her uncle who wanted to be part of her life. I told him that was up to Lauren and me, and we'd need to see sustained change in his behavior and attitude before we'd consider it. He said that was fair, and he'd wait as long as it took. We talked for another hour about Derek, about Gregory's therapy, about the family dynamics that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so long. When we parted ways, I still felt guarded, but I also felt like maybe there was a path forward. I called Derek on the drive home and told him about the conversation. He said his dad had been really working on himself, going to therapy weekly and reading books about adoption and different family structures. Derek said he'd noticed a real change in how his dad talked about family, and he was cautiously hopeful. I told Lauren everything when I got home, and she listened carefully before speaking. She said she was glad Gregory was doing the work, but she needed more time before she was ready to let him near Maya. I told her I completely understood, and there was no rush. We'd take things at whatever pace felt right for our family. Over the next few months, Gregory would occasionally text me articles about transracial adoption or ask questions about Maya's development, trying to show interest and learn. I appreciated the effort even though I remained cautious. My relationship with my parents slowly healed as they saw Gregory taking genuine responsibility for his behavior. My mom admitted she'd spent too many years making excuses for her brother, and she was trying to break that pattern. My dad said the whole situation had taught him that protecting people from consequences wasn't actually love, it was enabling. 6 months after our coffee shop conversation, Gregory asked if he could come to Maya's birthday party. She'd be turning 4 in a few weeks. I talked to Lauren, and after a long discussion, we agreed to let him come with clear boundaries. If he made any inappropriate comments, he'd be asked to leave immediately and wouldn't get another chance. I called Gregory and laid out the terms, and he agreed without hesitation. The party was at a local park, and Gregory arrived early, bringing a carefully chosen gift that reflected Maya's actual interests. He was quiet during the party, mostly staying on the periphery and watching. Maya was shy around him at first, not knowing who this man was. But when she fell and scraped her knee, Gregory was closest and helped her up, getting a Band-Aid from his pocket and making her laugh with a silly joke. Lauren watched the interaction carefully, and afterward, she told me it was the first time she'd seen Gregory treat Maya like he would any other child in the family. The next family gathering was Thanksgiving, and this time Gregory was invited with everyone else. The dinner was still somewhat awkward, but it wasn't toxic. Gregory asked Maya about her favorite cartoon and listened attentively when she explained the plot in the rambling way 4-year-olds do. He told me quietly that she was a special kid, and he was sorry he'd wasted 2 years not getting to know her. I told him he still had time to build a relationship with her if he kept working on himself. My mom looked happier than I'd seen her in years, having her whole family together without the undercurrent of tension. My dad pulled me aside after dinner and said he was proud of me for holding firm on my boundaries and for giving Gregory a chance to change. He said not many people would have done both of those things, and it showed strength of character. That Christmas, Maya was old enough to really understand the holidays, and she was excited about seeing her whole family. Gregory brought her a thoughtful gift, a children's book about adoption that celebrated different kinds of families. Lauren cried when she saw it, not from sadness, but from the acknowledgement that Gregory was genuinely trying to understand our experience. Maya loved the book and asked us to read it every night for weeks. Slowly, carefully, Gregory became a presence in Maya's life, not overbearing or trying to make up for lost time, just consistent and kind. He'd ask about her preschool activities and remember details from previous conversations. He'd include her in family activities the same way he included all his nieces and nephews. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real. Derek and I had grown close again, and he'd become like a brother to Maya. He'd take her to the park and teach her to kick a soccer ball, and she adored him. Derek told me one evening that watching his dad work so hard to change had been healing for him too. It helped him believe that their relationship could survive the truth about his paternity. He said he'd decided to keep calling Gregory Dad, because that's who he'd been for 30 years, DNA or not. I told Derek that was exactly right, and I was glad he'd found peace with it. Derek said seeing Maya so loved by everyone, biological connections or not, had shown him what family could look like when people chose it intentionally rather than just assuming blood made it automatic. 2 years after the confrontation, my family gathered at my parents' house for Easter. Maya was almost 6 now, chatty and confident and completely secure in her place in the family. Gregory arrived with his new girlfriend, a kind woman who worked as a social worker and understood complex family dynamics. She and Lauren hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared frustration with people who didn't understand adoption. At dinner, Maya was showing everyone a drawing she'd made at school of our family. It included me and Lauren, my parents, my sister's family, Derek, and Gregory. She'd drawn Gregory in purple because that was her favorite color, and she told him very seriously that he was purple in her picture. Gregory's eyes got bright with tears, and he told her it was the best picture anyone had ever drawn of him. After dinner, Gregory asked if he could talk to me and Lauren privately. We went out to the back porch while my mom watched Maya inside. Gregory told us he wanted to officially apologize, not the forced apology from 2 years ago, but a real one now that he understood what he'd been apologizing for. He said he'd been ignorant and cruel, speaking from a place of fear and rigidity rather than love. He said Maya had taught him more about family than any biological connection ever had. He thanked us for giving him the chance to be part of her life despite everything he'd done to hurt us. Lauren reached over and squeezed his hand, telling him she could see how much work he'd put into changing, and she appreciated it. I told Gregory that watching him grow and change had been one of the unexpected gifts of a very painful situation. We'd all had to examine what family meant and choose it consciously rather than assuming it. Later that night, after Maya was asleep and Lauren and I were getting ready for bed, she told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything with Gregory. She said a lot of people would have cut him off permanently or held a grudge, but I'd left room for redemption while still protecting our family. I told her I'd had a good example in Derek, who'd shown me that relationships could survive and even strengthen through painful truths. Lauren said she'd been thinking about something, and she wanted to know if I'd be open to adopting again. We'd always talked about having 2 children, but after everything with Gregory, we'd put those plans on hold. Now, with the family stable and Gregory's transformation seeming genuine, she felt ready to expand our family. I told her I'd been thinking the same thing, and we started looking into adoption processes again. 18 months later, we brought home our son, Ethan, from foster care. He was 3 years old with a complicated history and a shy smile. Maya was thrilled to be a big sister and insisted on helping with everything. The family gathering to meet Ethan was warm and welcoming. Gregory arrived with a thoughtful gift, a blanket embroidered with Ethan's name and adoption date. He spent time talking to Ethan at the child's level, not pushing, but being present. My mom cried happy tears watching her grandchildren play together. My dad pulled me aside and said he never thought he'd see the family heal like this after everything that had happened. He said sometimes the most broken things, when put back together carefully, ended up stronger than they'd been before. Derek became a constant presence in both Maya and Ethan's lives, the cool, older cousin who took them on adventures and spoiled them appropriately. He told me one evening that he was starting the adoption process himself, inspired by watching our family. I told him he'd be an amazing father, and I meant it. Gregory's girlfriend had become his fiancée, and she brought her own daughter from a previous marriage into family gatherings. Watching Gregory navigate being a stepfather, I saw him apply all the lessons he'd learned. He never made distinctions between biological and non-biological family members. He treated all the kids with the same care and attention, and they loved him for it. 3 years after the confrontation, my family had transformed into something I'd never imagined possible. We'd gone from a group of people connected by blood but divided by beliefs to a chosen family bound by mutual respect and love. Gregory had become not just tolerable, but genuinely valued, someone whose journey from rigid thinking to open-heartedness inspired all of us. Maya and Ethan were growing up in a family that celebrated their origins while fully embracing them as they were. Lauren and I had built a marriage that could withstand pressure and come out stronger. And I'd learned that protecting your family sometimes meant confronting painful truths, setting hard boundaries, and then, if the work was done, allowing space for redemption. Family, I'd learned, wasn't about who shared your DNA. It was about who showed up, who did the work, and who chose love over ego. And by that measure, we'd built something real. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.